I've learned a lot about the internals of the Spelunky games. This is a series where I'll give some insight into how I made certain tools or mods that hopefully others can learn from. Up first is the Tunnelman mod for Spelunky HD. Anyone who's played Classic will be familiar with Tunnelman. With this character, you start with only 2 hearts, 0 bombs, 0 ropes, and your whip is replaced with a permanent mattock. This is a really fun mode that didn't make it to the later installments of the series, so I decided it would be fun to support it for Spelunky HD. Side note, I've also created a version for Spelunky 2, link in the description. First, I'll show you quickly how to play as Tunnelman if that's all you're here for. You'll want to head over to the GitHub page to download and install HD Toolbox. The installer should be pretty self-explanatory. Once installed, you can launch HD Toolbox. There are a lot of tools available here, but the one we're looking for is Specs. Once on the Specs tab, you'll want to choose Latest as your load method. Launch Spelunky, and then launch Specs. You'll see the overlay appear. Specs is a tool that allows you to attach to Spelunky and do all kinds of fun introspection and modification to the game. Today, we're just going to head over to the Mods tab and select Tunnelman. Then you can press Insert to hide the menu and play the game. As you can see, now we have a mattock when we whip, and we have fewer resources. Don't forget, you can't whip in the air. If you like playing as Tunnelman, we even have some triathlon categories on Moss Ranking. Now onto the internals. I started this series with Tunnelman because while being technically challenging, there are only a few components you need to worry about. Updating a few starting resources, replace the whip with the mattock, and prevent whipping while in the air. Let's start with the resources. We want to make sure that we can update health, bombs, and ropes. In Spelunky, there's a giant structure we call Global State that contains just about everything you'd want to know about what's happening in the game. Part of that structure is what we call the player data structures for each of the players. There are also pointers to the player entities, but they're not always guaranteed to exist, for example, when you get crushed. Updating the resources is potentially pretty easy since we can just access the memory on the global struct. Here you can see we have health, bombs, and ropes. But the question is when best to update this. You need to make sure you handle the transitions from the title screen as well as quick restarts from the death screen. Thankfully, there's a function that the game itself uses that is called every time you reset the run to reset all of the state for a run. You can even see here where the health and resource defaults are set up. So what I decided to do is to hook somewhere in this function where we can run our own code. We need to make sure it happens after the resource setup, so I'd like to do it as late as possible. Let's go to the last instruction right before the function returns. To give a quick overview, this is Ghidra. On the right here is a decompiled view showing an approximation of what the C code might have looked like. On the left here is the disassembler. This is taking the machine code and showing you what the assembly is for it. Here we can see the last operation of this function is a move. So we know we want a hook right here. What does that look like? Here's where we set up the hook. We know we're going to be hooking 6 bytes at the memory address found here. And then we want to jump back to right after the memory address we're hooking. And then we set up our hook. Let's see what the hook function actually looks like. When you're hooking, there's a couple things you want to be careful of. First, calling a function will potentially clobber some registers that the hooked function is depending on. We also want to make sure to take care of calling the code that we clobbered to set up our hook. In our hook function, the first thing we do is call the same code that we overwrote. Next, we push all registers onto the stack, preserving them. Next, we call our function if the TunnelMan mod is enabled. We'll take a look at that in a second. After that, we restore any registers that had been saved onto the stack. And then we jump back to the memory address after our hook. If we look at our reset TunnelMan state function, you can see it's very simple. We just initialize the health, the bombs, and the ropes. And if a player entity exists, we set the health there as well. The next thing we want to do is replace the whip with the matic. The way whipping works is when you press the attack button, a whip is spawned and placed as your held item. For this modification, I decided to replace the whip with a matic as it is spawned. This required hooking another function, specifically the spawn entity function. Here we hook the function right before it adds the entity to the array of active entities. This hook is a little more complicated than our last one. You see, just as before, we run the code that we clobbered and save the registers to the stack. But we also do something a little different. The ESI register contains a pointer to the spawned entity. So we copy that into a local variable in our function. Then we call our custom code, which takes a pointer to an entity and returns an entity. We'll look at that in a second. We restore the registers, and then we push our returned entity back into ESI and zero out our local variable, and then jump back to the location right after our hook. So let's take a look at this function. As you can see, it takes a pointer to the entity and returns a pointer to an entity. Here we check if we have a global state and the screen state and play state are 0, which essentially means normal gameplay. If the entity exists, and that entity is entity type 109. This specifically is the entity type for a whip. So if we see a whip being spawned, we set the alpha to 0 and we tell the game to delete it. Then we spawn a new entity at the same location, entity 510, which is a matic. And we return our matic. If it was not a whip, we just return the spawned entity as it was. The last thing we need to do is prevent using the matic while in the air, as that is a significant part of the challenge of using TunnelMan. Since we just replaced the whip with a matic entity, it would work anywhere the whip would normally work. My first attempt at solving this was just to delete the matic if you're in the air. But this didn't work great, as you'd still see the animation of whipping, just without an item. My next option was to hook right before the whip occurred. This was a bit more complicated, because rather than just wanting to inject some custom code, I needed to change the control flow of the program. This is the place where whipping actually occurs. Here is all of the criteria required to allow a spelunker to whip. What we want to say is if you're in the air, jump past this block completely to this memory address. So what does that hook look like? Here you can see I set up the hook as normal, but I add an extra address for where I'll be jumping if I want to skip whipping. Let's take a look at the hook. This time you can see I don't bother running the code I clobbered right away. I just save the registers. That's because that code isn't important if I'm going to just jump past the condition anyways. Next, I check if the player does not have a crysknife and they're not on the floor. Restore the registers and jump past the whip block. Otherwise, we'll restore the registers, run our clobbered code, and jump back to the memory address after our hook. And that's all there is to making Tunnel Man in Spelunky HD. I know this was very technical and I probably missed some details. So if you have any questions, feel free to comment down below and I'll do my best to answer them. I hope to do more deep dives into various tools and mods, so if you have any suggestions for what I should do next, let me know. And feel free to join the Spelunky community Discord server if you're interested in modding and have any questions. Enjoy Tunnel Man and have a great day.